In October of 1997, a 15-year-old boy named John Hartman was beaten to death on the streets of Fairbanks, Alaska. 4 young men, 3 of them Athabascan Indians, were convicted of his murder. Yet years later, the case remains open and unsolved. Who's responsible? How many killers were out on the streets that night? Was racism to blame for these convictions? I'm your host, Matt Ralston, and this is the story of John Hartman and the Fairbanks Four, case of murder on ice.
Well, I really hope you've been enjoying the show. If so, there's a few things you have to do that would really help out a lot. Most important thing is just tell a friend about the show. If they like murder stuff, just tell them about Murder on Ice. Tell them it's the best murder podcast that you've ever heard and that the host is awesome. Besides that, follow Murder on Ice on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. You should be able to find it pretty easily. And write and review on iTunes. Just leave a few words of a review. That's kind of how they aggregate things, and it helps a lot. Also, I have some really exciting news. A new podcast, Death Row Diaries. Yes, it's coming soon. See, there's a lot of shows where people sit around and snarkily gossip about murder and stuff, and they have martinis or whatever. And yeah, I go straight to the source. I'm co-hosting this show with a guy named William Noguera. And he's on death row right now. Literally, he's sitting on death row. He's been on death row for murder since 1983, right when I was born. He's an interesting guy. He's a renowned artist. He paints and draws from death row. He's had exhibits in major art galleries, museums all around the country, all around the world, actually. And we struck up a interesting relationship. And, you know, what we talk about is people he's met on death row in California at San Quentin. People like Rodney Alcala, the dating game killer, Richard Ramirez, the infamous Night Stalker, Charles Manson. He's had to interact with all these guys. They were all on death row in San Quentin with him. So this is obviously not your average murder podcast, and I think you'll enjoy it. So look for it. Death Row Diaries. Yeah. The public safety section of the Daily News Miner, Interior Alaska's only major newspaper, and major is a somewhat flattering description, is notorious around Fairbanks. The first thing most people turn the page to or click on. It's an up-to-date catalog of recent arrests made by law enforcement officials, and readers get a good chuckle out of the cockamamie antics of the locals, which they find emblematic of their community. Usually drunken people doing stupid things like stealing a 5-gallon vat of nacho cheese from the local convenience store, pushing the envelope, small-town hijinks which illustrate the absurd reality of Fairbanks. Here's a typical entry. Monty Cazzetto was charged January 19th with using a motorized vehicle to harass or molest game after witnesses allegedly saw him run over a group of mallard ducks on a roadway adjacent to Swan Lake in Sitka, according to Sitka police. According to Alaska wildlife troopers, Cazzetto killed 1 duck and injured several others. Troopers issued a summons against Cazzetto, and he is scheduled to appear in district court. Adding to the allure of the public safety report is that Fairbanks is a small enough community that locals have pretty decent odds of recognizing the name of someone who's been arrested. Not charged, by the way. If you're innocent, there's no retraction. It's just saying, hey, you were arrested, that's all. Good luck getting fired from your job. I used to recognize the names of people I went to high school with. Most of it was getting DUIs. And that used to be about 75% of the content. Though increasingly police are finding people in possession of little baggies of crystal meth or heroin, something you'd rarely read about decades ago. I haven't lived in Fairbanks in quite some time. So, as my connection to the place fades, it's harder and harder for me to entertain myself in this nosy pursuit. Rarely do I recognize someone I know in the public safety section. I recognize the last names, those of known clans around town. Someone's nephew or niece, who I remember as a little girl, has now grown up and is committing acts of domestic violence against her boyfriend, taunting police by mooning them out the window of their downtown loft. They grow up so fast. Over the years, various news writers have added their own slant to the public safety report. For a while, it was hyper-mimetic about itself and reported arrests with a sensationalized paparazzi-esque bent. In one notable example, a DUI suspect smelled of sex in 100 proof. Here's an example of that era from August 2013. Janice Christine Smith, 21, of Fairbanks, was arrested on a felony theft charge for allegedly stealing a man's wallet and removing his credit cards at the Refinery Lounge in North Pole early Sunday morning. The victim called the North Pole police at 2:21 a.m. to report that Smith had stolen his wallet in the bar. The wallet was returned to him with the credit cards missing, and he said Smith was last seen running from the bar in a bikini. North Pole police located Smith on Santa Claus Lane and found several credit cards wedged into her buttocks, according to charging documents. Other stolen items were later recovered from Smith's buttocks area during a search at Fairbanks Correctional Center, including a driver's license and a $10 bill. The victim told police that Smith approached him in the bar and grabbed his buttocks and genital region, making him uncomfortable. He noticed his wallet missing from his back pocket shortly afterwards. Bar staff recovered the wallet from Smith in the bathroom, but the man's credit cards were gone, wedged into her buttocks. It's got to be a record for the use of the word buttocks in one article. Prior to this, there was a Renaissance period in which the public safety report took on a Norristic literary quality, with the newsman acting as the narrator, each incident its own pulpy novella. From February of 2011. As taxi driver Randy Casey drove a suspected bank robber toward the Canada border Tuesday afternoon, he looked at a pair of baby shoes hanging from his rearview mirror. If things went badly, he worried he might not have another chance to see his 10-month-old son. The man in the back seat had recently told the 56-year-old cab driver that he had used a 9mm Beretta in a Valentine's Day robbery of a First National Bank of Alaska. The man told him that he'd robbed other banks in the past and that he was fine-tuning his art, Casey said. His fare did not say what he had planned for his driver when they reached their remote destination near the Canada border. But Casey was worried what he might do to someone who had heard his confession. Wow, I can't wait for the next episode. Will the bank robber rape the cabbie? Who knows? The public safety report is often a light-hearted indulgence, a brief, harmless respite in schadenfreude to go with your morning coffee, distract you from the fact that your oldest daughter, currently employed as a dancer somewhere around Prim, hasn't called you in 16 months. As I read the Fairbanks Daily News Miner's website this morning, because I had been alerted there was a new development in an ongoing lawsuit regarding the Fairbanks Four, which I'll get to soon, I couldn't help but spend an hour browsing the public safety section. Does this count as work, I thought? And
How many combinations of things can I make with eggs, cheese, mushrooms, and salsa? Let's see, 4 times 4 times 4 times 4. But sometimes the public safety section is not funny. It's tragic. It makes you feel dirty for reading it for a laugh. Such as on Christmas Eve of 2018, an incident which ties into the case of the Fairbanks Four, though they had been released from prison long before. 20-year-old Cody Ayer, a half-white, half-Inupiaq Eskimo guy, was at his house, where he lived with his parents off of Farmers Loop Road in Fairbanks. It was Christmas Eve. He had an argument with his girlfriend, which apparently stemmed from his renewed interest in a former girlfriend of his. His current girlfriend didn't appreciate this, broke up with him, and left. Cody had been depressed, as he had a lifelong dream of serving in the military and had recently been recommended for separation from the Air National Guard. He had attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and a learning disability. This didn't necessarily bar him from serving in the Air National Guard, but he hadn't disclosed these conditions prior to arriving to training, and it worked out badly. Cody, now living at home and having just broken up with his girlfriend, grabbed a bottle of Crown Royal and a .22 revolver and started filming a video on Facebook Live in which he was walking around in the 10-degree below zero weather, drinking and crying and complaining that his ex-girlfriend, the previous one to his ex-girlfriend, didn't want to get coffee with him. He showed viewers that he had one bullet in the chamber of his gun and put it up to his head. "I'm not going to do this until I have more viewers," he warned. Then he ended the video. A Facebook friend of his who lived in Wasilla, Alaska, about 8 hours away, saw the video and alerted the police in Fairbanks. Soon after this call took place, Cody's mom arrived home and saw her son walking, blathering, holding the gun. She followed him in her SUV, pleading for him to end this tantrum, but he ignored her. So she called her husband, and they decided to call 911 to have police come, try and talk some sense into Cody, de-escalate the situation before he harmed himself. "My son has been drinking and he just broke up with his girlfriend and he's walking down the sidewalk and he has a gun, and I would really like you guys to come and pick him up," she said. The vision that she had in her mind was likely a bespectacled man with a parted haircut holding a megaphone, coaxing Cody into a cruiser. It was not a SWAT team of 7 officers armed with AR-15s. Though Cody was carrying a loaded gun, he was threatening to harm himself, not others. He had walked from his home up to a major highway, and now he was walking down the middle of the lane as the cops had blocked the highway off, the snow crunching under his feet. He's clearly not in his right mind, snarling like some kind of wild animal, yelling like a banshee. Police shined a blinding spotlight on him. They repeatedly pleaded for him to drop his gun. This body cam footage is from Trooper Elandre Johnson. Also present was a Tyler Latimer of the Fairbanks Police Department.
"Put the gun down! Put the gun down! Put the gun down!" Stop right here. Go bring your vehicle forward. You have to make a call. I can't see what he's doing from that location. Negative. We're at the intersection right now. We've given him a lot of space. He's gestured the gun towards me at least twice, and he's walking to the intersection at Johansson. He won't put the gun down and he's continuing to scream. We got the intersection blocked as best we can here. He's walking towards the troopers now. Put the gun down, Cody!
Cody now turns off the highway and walks down a desolate, snowy street into the frigid blackness. This road leads to a residential neighborhood.
He's walking behind the church.
I don't know who the fuck you are!
Hey, Trooper Johnson with the Alaska State Troopers. Stop right there.
Obviously don't give a fuck!
He's got the gun up to his head. He's continuing to walk away. We're kind of following him at this point to a residential area. What do you want us to do, 1D3? Put the gun down, Cody.
I will fucking
any troopers?
if you guys fucking care!
Hey, you gotta stop moving, Cody.
Cody now stops in the middle of the tree-lined street, where you can see other houses present in the distance, stands in the middle of the road and announces, "I will fucking blow my head off." He's facing a wall of officers, nothing behind him.
I'm going to kill myself.
Drop the gun!
Literally, if one of you talks one more time, I'm going to kill myself. You think I'm fucking joking? I'm fucking done. It's not fucking funny!
1024.
I'm done. You don't even know. Like, seriously.
Cody now screams about his personal problems, about getting kicked out of the military, howling at the moon. He gets down on the ground. He gets up off the ground abruptly, in a split second, with the gun in his hand. And I'm frankly surprised he doesn't get shot at this point. He announces that he's going to kill himself again. He's done with life. If anyone gets closer to him, he's going to splatter his goose. He tells the officers, with guns trained on him, to turn their strobe light off. They don't.
Fucking done! I'm trying to get out!
Let's back up.
I'm joining the fucking military to get out!
Back up.
I can't get out!
He laments his failed military career once more. Then he directs his first threat at the officers, saying something like, "You guys can fucking die right now. I don't give a fuck." He barely finishes this sentence before they open up on him, firing more than 40 shots, 23 of which struck Cody, who died immediately from a single shot, which hit him in the back of the head, though he had been facing the officers when they opened fire.
You guys can fucking die right now and I don't give a fuck!
Certainly these officers had good intentions. They didn't set out to kill Cody. Yet Cody's family was left wondering how a call to help their son had ended in his death perhaps as sending 7 officers, many of whom were armed with AR-15s, which they ended up spraying Cody with after a mere 11 minutes, could possibly defuse the situation or do anything but escalate it. Cody's death was the result of poor training and judgment by a swatted-up group of officers who failed in their primary duty to protect Cody, said Cody's sister, Samantha Ayer Harrison. Indeed, when watching the news, I'm left to wonder, nearly daily in this day and age, how it is that police routinely fire rubber bullets into groups of protesters and real hollow points into people in situations like Cody's. They have the technology. Doesn't seem like a willingness to incorporate it, unless that is, people are peacefully protesting. You can't spray them with real bullets. This isn't China. Yet. Cody Ayer's father was more blunt than his sister in a post he wrote on a Facebook page called Keep Walking for Cody, an event organized in his memory, which draws many supporters. In 2 days, we will endure the start of month 9 since the murder of our son Cody Ayer. No police report and no body cam footage. It is becoming evident that a cover-up is in the works. 5 officers, 3 Alaska State Troopers, and 2 Fairbanks Police Department officers shot my son in the back of the head, proving themselves to be cowards of the worst kind. I long for the day that I can look them in the eye. I pray every day that God give me the chance to stand before them, and that he make them answer for their crimes against my son. The family's frustration in getting to the bottom of what happened that night, how a call for help led to a call to the coroner, stemmed from a long internal review process on the part of the Fairbanks Police Department. It took them 10 months to release the body cam footage, at which point they found that they'd acted appropriately, and that even though they did nothing wrong, that the officers were protected by something called qualified immunity. In short, qualified immunity shields a police officer or any government official from prosecution unless they violate a clearly established right. The alleged violation must be so obvious and apparent that any reasonable officer would know they are violating a civil right, said Anchorage attorney James Christie. So an officer who rapes a suspect isn't protected by qualified immunity, because that conduct falls clearly outside the scope of what an officer is expected to do, said Christie. But an officer who shoots a subject they find threatening is well within their rights. What they find threatening is pretty subjective. You can't help but think of Derek Chauvin. Clearly, that was out of bounds. But this is the level of flagrancy it takes to beat qualified immunity. A snuff film, a public execution. Qualified immunity has been instituted and routinely reinforced by the courts, by judges, as qualified immunity serves to protect public officials, such as people who are elected or appointed, people like judges. Where would Clarence Thomas be without qualified immunity? Maybe not chilling in his cabin. The issue of qualified immunity came up in the next article I read this morning, in the Fairbanks Daily News Miner, as I was sipping my Mountain Dew in Smirnoff. The Fairbanks Four, George Freese, Eugene Vent, Kevin Peace, and Marvin Roberts, the 4 guys accused of murdering John Hartman, who have since been released from prison, have an ongoing civil lawsuit against the City of Fairbanks and against Detective Aaron Ring, as well as his associates, who were responsible for investigating them. An investigation often described as Bush League, which landed the Fairbanks Four behind bars. They are suing the city, Detective Ring, and 3 other officers and detectives for civil rights violations, malicious prosecution, and wrongful imprisonment. After all, it's alleged that Detective Ring physically intimidated a drunken 17-year-old Eugene Vent, that he would often stop the recording of his interrogation, which is illegal, and verbally or physically threaten his subjects. It was alleged by at least 5 witnesses that he would intimidate them if their story wasn't exactly what he wanted to hear. We know that Detective Aaron Ring and prosecuting attorney Jeff O'Brien physically constructed an exhibit in a motel room and made a label that said Alaska State Scientific Crime Laboratory. This bogus exhibit matched the wounds on John Hartman's face to the tread on George Freese's boots, but it was not scientific. It was made by a cop and a lawyer, meaning they falsified evidence. We know that during trial, prosecutor Jeff O'Brien compared native witnesses who backed up the Fairbanks Four's account to slaves, unruly slaves who stepped forward in the story of Spartacus. We know the Fairbanks Police Department withheld exculpatory evidence from the defense teams of the Fairbanks Four, including that John Hartman's friend Chris Stone told them he was scared when my friend died, meaning he likely witnessed the murder, and that they knew the distance from which Arlo Olson identified the Fairbanks Four as assaulting a guy from 550 feet away in the dark was impossible. Yet they kept this information from the incompetent lawyers of the Fairbanks Four who never thought to measure it. We know the district attorney allowed Arlo Olson and a pederast named Joshua Bradshaw, who ended up serving only a few months in prison for raping a child after testifying against the Fairbanks Four, as well as others, were allowed to trade their testimony for reduced sentences. In order to get out of prison, the Fairbanks Four agreed, as part of the conditional terms of their release, not to sue the city of Fairbanks. The courts eventually found this agreement flawed and cleared the path allowing them to sue. So that's what I read this morning. In a bold move, the city of Fairbanks is now suing the Fairbanks Four. Bad boy George Freese, youngster Eugene Vent, white boy Kevin Peace, and frontman Marvin Roberts. The city is suing these 4 men for breach of contract because these 4 men are suing the city after agreeing not to sue the city so they could get out of prison. It's incredibly Byzantine. And 3 weeks from now, historians will look back on stuff like this and find this society to be an utter joke. The city of Fairbanks wants their legal fees for defending themselves against the lawsuit, which seems like a valid lawsuit, of the Fairbanks Four reimbursed. The city really does not want to pay these guys for being wrongfully incarcerated. Attorneys for the city of Fairbanks released a statement. Under the terms of the settlement agreement, each plaintiff covenanted not to bring any further legal action arising out of the murder of John Hartman, and expressly waived any claims against the city and its officers. Plaintiffs have failed to fulfill their duties under the settlement agreement by taking actions directly contrary to their covenants to refrain from bringing further action against the city and its present or former employees arising out of the murder of John Hartman. Plaintiffs' damages, if any, were caused in whole or in part by parties other than the city, including the states of Alaska. The city does not prosecute murder charges or influence the prosecution of the underlying charges at issue in this dispute, sir.
They sound annoying, so I don't know. I just gave them an annoying voice. They just said the city doesn't influence the prosecution of suspects. That's rich. They have an entire department that does exactly that. I find it telling that we live in a society where the representatives of actual cities are able to release statements against 4 residents of that city to the rest of the residents in that city. Statements that if you read them just once, you can objectively tell are horseshit. Does anyone else find it interesting that a city, some lines in the dirt, is able to mutate, to personify itself, suddenly able to talk? And that the city, where so many have been born and died, the city which is the identity for so many, is able to issue half-truths against members of itself, of those who are part of it. How does the city decide who the parasites are? And how is it that whenever the city talks, it sounds like white lawyers who are not from the city? The city maintains that Aaron Ring and the others are protected by qualified immunity. Many people in the community of Fairbanks see this as a persistent problem. It's one that is also currently garnering national attention. Cody Ayers' shooting was by no means the worst case of an officer-involved killing this country has seen, given the circumstances. Circumstances being that Fairbanks police officers receive 10 hours of training total on how to handle situations such as Cody's. The situation being that officers in general appear far too eager to fire their weapons, to bring AR-15s to a suicide call. It still may have been justified. Maybe Cody was even committing suicide by cop. If you read the YouTube comments of that video, most people agree the shooting was justified. Hey, what do you expect? If you don't want to get shot, don't be waving a gun around in public. Do you have a criminal justice degree, or how did you inform this completely nuanced opinion? Hey, if you don't want to be murdered by a cop, don't be selling loose cigarettes or carrying around a counterfeit bill. Hey man, if you don't want to be killed by a cop with sleeve tattoos and tactical gear on and be pile drived in the parking lot of a Walmart, don't wear bright colors. It might attract them. Hey, fuck off. Alaska has the highest suicide rate in the country, over twice the national average. It's a problem, and yet apparently there's no protocol in place to deal with a suicidal person. No stash of rubber bullets laying around with those badass Oakleys in body armor. The reason that Cody's shooting struck a chord in Fairbanks is that people, particularly Native people, are sick of it. In the United States, Native Americans are more likely than white people to be killed by police. You might not have considered this, but Native Americans are also more likely than black people to be killed by the police. And Alaskans, more so than residents of any other state per capita, are the most likely to be killed by police. So given these factors, it's a problem, and people have noticed it. In fact, of the Fairbanks Four, Eugene Vent has 2 relatives who have been killed by police. And George Freese also has a relative who's been killed by police. Granted, these people were engaged in questionable behavior at the time, but the necessity of shooting them is the point of debate. And the numbers might not even bear out how lopsided the situation is. If a black person is killed by police, reasonably, in most cases, it's a common sense call on how their race is classified. With Native people, it's not as obvious. So if someone with a white sounding name who happens to be Native or part Native is shot by police, they're not always recorded as Native. I'm not saying identity politics are always a good play, but if you're on the other side of the trigger, you tend to think it's worth dabbling in, I've found. The reason there's body camera footage of Cody Ayers shooting is that Fairbanks police released the footage, albeit 10 months later, after much legal wrangling. They presumably released the footage because they thought it backed up their case, that they'd done nothing wrong. Their case was that they themselves found that they had done nothing wrong. They were threatened. When they aren't this confident, they don't release the tapes. It's up to the police to police themselves. That's the system we have. Internal reviews. Cops deciding if other cops did something wrong in the line of duty. Cops deciding if some cop who will be their judge and jury should the situation arise did something wrong. I wonder what they're going to decide. Did their drinking buddy break the law? Just a few miles from where Cody Ayers was shot, a coal-fired power plant run by a company called Aurora Energy pumps filthy coal-laden water into the Chena River, the waterway on which Fairbanks is built. The power plant has avoided fines and being shut down because they say they don't pollute the river. Indeed, they are in charge of monitoring themselves. They report the levels of their own pollution to the authorities. That's the system, and this is the norm on a national level. It's a libertarian philosophy of deregulation. See where it gets you. Massive floods and a thawed river. A lot of people making money that you don't share in. And if you think this system works, look at the bodies riddled with 23 bullet holes, or the metallic sheen on a river, which does not freeze downriver from this power plant. It stays thawed all winter in 40 below zero weather. One of the 5 officers who discharged their weapon into Cody Ayers was one officer, Tyler Latimer, who's no longer employed as a Fairbanks police officer. Latimer, a former member of the Air Force, whose Instagram page shows him decked out in an awful lot of holsters, harnesses, perhaps a life preserver. It's a lot of military gear. He's holding a large military assault rifle. Well, he'd already killed 2 other people in the line of duty prior to killing Cody Ayers. He's a young guy. He had not been serving in law enforcement for very long. Latimer does not work for the Fairbanks Police Department anymore, but he's being indemnified, that is, paid by the City of Fairbanks. Paid not to work as the lawsuit regarding Cody Ayers proceeds. So the city can pay the guy that shot Cody Ayers, but not his family, not the Fairbanks Four. This is the type of thing that really pisses some people off. Cody Ayers is just one example of the reason there's a growing divide in the community of Fairbanks between the people, especially the native people of Fairbanks, and the police. It was a divide that existed before the Fairbanks Four case, which likely led to their imprisonment under wrongful convictions, and it hasn't gotten better. If anything, it's gotten worse. Police also released a slickly produced YouTube video of their killing of 28-year-old native man James Richards in Fairbanks. He pistol whipped a few people in a hotel, then fled into the daylight with a gun, eventually appearing to take an elderly man standing at a bus stop as an apparent human shield. The cop shot him twice. He died. But for cases where there's more of a gray area, or allegations of abuse of power, cops don't release their body cam footage. Meaning it seems they're cherry-picking their own personal highlight reel, like cutting together a video of your poker tournament and only showing the hands that you won. About a third of the people killed by police in Alaska in recent years
are Native Alaskans, who make up about 12% of Alaska's population. So they're over twice as likely to be killed by police than anyone else. Native Alaskans also make up close to 40% of Alaska's prison population. Again, they're 12% of the population outside the prisons. No police officers or state troopers have ever lost their jobs in Alaska for killing someone in the line of duty. Ever, including those who were unarmed. Though officers in Alaska have recently been fired for smoking weed and lying to their superiors, but never for killing someone. Those 5 officers who fired their weapons at Cody Air, the internal review found they were justified in doing so to protect nearby residents. Cody had a gun. They didn't know what he was going to do. He was near houses. They didn't know if he was going to try and hurt someone else. It seems reasonable. But if we're using that logic, maybe not. Records show that bullets shot by officers hit 2 homes, which were over 300 feet from Cody. 2 AR-15 rounds hit a house behind him, as well as another nearby residence. One man found bullet holes 3 feet above the bed where his son slept. The bullet holes appeared to be like .223 caliber rounds from assault rifles. It made me wonder why so many shots were required for someone who had not yet fired a shot, he told the Anchorage Daily News. So I think we can throw the narrative about protecting innocent bystanders out the window. The police endangered more people than Cody ever did. Couple the Fairbanks Four story, which remains omnipresent in Fairbanks, with the fact that of all the people killed by police in recent years in the state of Alaska, 1 in 4 of these incidents happened in Fairbanks, a city of 30,000 people. The general area is about 1/7 the population of Alaska, so there's an even further disparity. It seems as though the police are establishing a dangerous presence in Fairbanks, one that I've seen firsthand, that the Fairbanks Four were subjected to. It's been a long, comfortable reign of oppression for them. All of this came to a head at a recent Fairbanks City Council meeting, directly in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd. William Satterberg, a criminal defense attorney who represents people who have been brutalized by the police, told council members that the results of investigation into excessive force complaints need to be made public. The system now is, if an officer roughs you up, you can complain. Sure, file a complaint. Go ahead. We welcome you to file a complaint. Will anyone look at your complaint? Will the guilty officer be disciplined or suffer any repercussions in any way for his actions? Who knows? That's confidential. Teal Soden is the communications director for the City of Fairbanks. She responded that unless an officer is charged with a crime, the results of complaints are considered personnel issues and kept classified. That's convenient because, due to qualified immunity, as we've seen, it's nearly impossible to charge an officer with a crime. So their carousel of bullshit just keeps going around and round. At this meeting, several people spoke about police brutality, and the mayor made a big, progressive, grandiose speech about the death of George Floyd.
The very tragic death of Mr. George Floyd has shined a national spotlight on law enforcement as a whole. And the anxiety and the anger over what happened and what it represents reaches all corners of the U.S., including right here in Fairbanks. There have been many questions and concerns that have been raised in recent days about how we handle things locally. And I would like to take a moment to talk about our police department here in Fairbanks. Over the past several years, staffing and budgetary challenges that we have faced have left room for improvement in our department. We have had an unprecedented amount of retirements and transfers of highly trained and experienced officers, which has left us with challenges as it pertains to our training. Challenges that we are determined to overcome. That said, Fairbanks has every reason to be proud of its police department. I've noticed several areas in which the FPD stands out in contrast to many other police departments in our nation. In all my years on the City Council and as mayor, I have seen that FPD has a record of holding their officers accountable, as they take great pride in being part of our city and do not want the badge tarnished by bad behavior. While the general public may not always know the results of internal investigations, they are something that I am kept involved with here at the city.
It was as if they most certainly anticipated that this national tragedy would reignite the anger that many in the community have felt for decades, which is rarely addressed. Eventually, the city council passed a resolution which stated that the council, quote, joins with America in sharing its sorrow, shame, and anger over the senseless death of George Floyd. The mayor didn't mention the others, those who had lived in the community of Fairbanks. They promised to do better. Will anything change? I don't know. I don't think anything has happened since then. One Native woman named
Lisa McNulty,
whose husband was killed at the hands of police in Fairbanks, said she was angry that the city council never addressed the issue of police brutality in Fairbanks until George Floyd was killed.
Thank you for the update on wanting to improve the police department. I want to let you all know how important this is to the Native and Black community. You stated that the police department have been using less lethal force for many years, but what about the many deaths of many Alaska Natives in this town in the last few years? They need to do a better job. This is about human beings who have families and children. Amid the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, I want to know, what is the city doing to protect us minorities in this city? My husband died by two troopers, Aaron Mobley and Michael Kay, a year ago. The investigation report states that they only shot 9 times when they shot 13 times. And also the deaths of many Alaska Natives shot in this town, Cody Iyer, Tristan Vent, and Corwin Vent. According to the CNN, Native Americans are more likely to be killed by law enforcement than other racial or ethnic groups, with African Americans being the second highest.
The city's projected revenue for 2021 is about $35 million. To give the Fairbanks Four $1 million each for their troubles, spending 18 years in prison, that'd be about $125 per resident. But that doesn't seem fair. I wouldn't want to pony it up. What about we take the 4 cops who violated their civil rights, take it out of their pensions? What if there was a tax on public complaints? Every time you were found to intimidate a 16-year-old girl while in the line of duty, $10,000. Put it into a jar right above the refrigerator in the break room of City Hall. Aaron Ring and his buddies would be paying off the Fairbanks Four in no time. What if the city actually worked for a solution instead of taking the cowardly way out and suing their own citizens? To quote the late Leonard Cohen, everybody knows that the dice are loaded. Everybody rolls with their fingers crossed. Everybody knows the war is over. Everybody knows the good guys lost. Everybody knows the fight is fixed. The poor stay poor. The rich get rich. That's how it goes. Everybody knows.
Yeah. Huh? Follow us on Instagram at Murder on Ice, and Twitter, and find me, the Matt Ralston, on Instagram. And tell people about the show. Tell them you like it. Tell them you got problems. Also, check out Death Row Diaries. I'm talking to a guy on death row. Literally, me talking to a dude who's sitting on death row. And we talk about stuff. It's crazy. Anyway, as always, I'm Matt Ralston, and I'll be around.